And you, from there, you ended up also going to South Sudan, and again, just a place of complete evil and darkness. For those of you that don't know anything about Sudan, pulled a little clip from the Independent. A guy named, this is 2014, Siobhan Fenton wrote this. More than 100 children have been killed in South Sudan, whilst many others have been raped and castrated, according to UNICEF. UNICEF says that 129 children have been murdered in the last 3 weeks alone, while surviving boys were castrated and girls were raped. They say that some children were even thrown into burning buildings. The executive director of UNICEF, Anthony Lake, said the violence against children in South Sudan has reached a new level of brutality. The details of the worsening violence against children are unspeakable, but we must speak of them. Survivors report that boys have been castrated and left to bleed to death. Girls as young as 8 have been gang raped and murdered. Children have been tied together before their attackers slit their throats. Others have been thrown into burning buildings. Just a nightmare scenario.
Yeah.
And I'm going to clarify one thing. You're working for an NGO. For those of you that don't know what that is, it's a non-government organization. Generally, you're talking about some kind of a benevolent organization that is trying to do good in the world, such as the Red Cross is probably the premier example.
Yeah.
I know you weren't specifically working for the Red Cross, but you were working for another benevolent organization. Yeah. When they called you up and brought you down to South Sudan. And again, you're not, for the most part, going to the front lines and capturing the action of the war. What you're capturing is the results of the war.
Sure.
And what did you see when you got to Sudan?
Well, we flew into Juba, and what we were looking at were UN camps. So the situation in South Sudan was that the two tribes, the Dinka tribe and the Nuer tribe, were at war with each other. And there was a lot of fighting and killing going on. And what the UN was trying to do was segregate the tribes from each other in certain areas so that they just stopped killing each other. Because until the killing stopped, then really politically they were never going to come to and you had the president and the vice president. One was a Dinka and one was a Nuer, and whatever was happening between them was being mirrored, on the street, so to speak. So, and there was never any trust between those two men. They have a lot of history, and there was never too much trust. So, it was when they got their independence, I think Sudan, it was only 3 years. It had been independent for 3 years, South Sudan. Like yeah. So, we were visiting camps that were, had segregated the tribes, and Juba was probably the most aggressive camp in that the only time we ever had any trouble was maybe if a couple of guys had got a hold of some alcohol and they wanted to know, hey, what are you doing here, in this place? Why are you here? Why are you taking... And what you have to remember is these people don't want to be photographed in this situation. Mm-hmm. This is not a good situation for them. And it's very easy as a journalist to go into a situation and say, yes, I have to document this and I have to show what's going on. But you have to understand that the dignity of these people needs to be taken into consideration. And, some people are fine. They're fine to let you photograph them. They go, yeah, well, this is where I am at the moment. And so, yeah, I'm quite happy for you to photograph me, and others quite plainly aren't. So, apart from the sort of criteria that the NGO was looking for, and the NGO was effectively providing water for these camps because and they'd worked out some sort of desalination process, and they were able to produce water on a regular basis for the camps. But the situation in the camps was incredible. They were just so overcrowded, and again, back to that sort of scenario of people being cramped on top of each other, and then that's how diseases spread, and so on. So there were obviously certain parts of South Sudan that I wanted to travel to because I knew that the situation up in those parts of the country was even worse than Juba was relatively stable compared to other parts of Sudan. There was a place called Bentiu that I wanted to get to, and there's a lot of oil up there, and both tribes are trying to control the oil. That's what they need to get hold of. And as we were sort of, I'd say, listen, let's go there, and the NGO security would say you can't because there's fighting, and we're not allowing staff to fly in, and the only time aid is getting to these places is helicopter drops, but no one's touching the ground, and and the NGO are very hot on security. It's Oxfam. The NGO is Oxfam, and they're incredibly professional organisation, and they're very hot on security. And anywhere you go, if you go to any country working for Oxfam, the first thing you get is a security briefing, and they tell you what the situation is, what you can and can't do, where they advise that we don't go, and these are the regulations and the stipulations that they make, and you have to adhere to them because you're there as a member of staff even though I'm a freelancer and I can technically do what I like, you have to really sort of bear in mind that you are out there working with Oxfam staff, and Oxfam staff have travelled out from the UK with you. So you really can't just go off-piste and start doing what you like, because you could put other people's lives, in jeopardy. So everywhere we wanted to go, I particularly wanted to go, we couldn't. And it was just always the case. I wanted to go here. No, you can't go there, but you can go here. So we ended up traveling to areas that weren't where the security risk was pretty low. And these were camps, UN camps, UN mission camps that were created to where the fighting was at its worst, and they were trying to stop the tribes from killing each other. And one of the places we went to, which I will never forget, is a place called Bor, and we sort of flew in a small plane, and we got I think it was a helicopter, then a small plane. Unfortunately, we didn't have to drive because I've been on a few journeys through Africa, maybe 10, 14 hours in a car where there's no road. So we were grateful to be able to fly in. And you couldn't always fly in. We'd always get in maybe a UN helicopter that was dropping something, and we just get in there and fly it with them. And we got to this place, and Oxfam were working there, and they were providing water, and they had this situation where the camp was being run by the South Koreans, and they were sort of they were physically building the camp, and they were in charge of it at the time, and they had created this space, maybe the size of 2 British football pitches, or maybe a couple of American football pitches, similar sort of thing, for people to live on. And in this, you had South Sudanese. They were the newer tribe living in here, and you had wealthy, you had middle class, and you had very poor living alongside each other in the camp. So there was a real mix of people in the camp, and Oxfam were providing water, and there was a huge reservoir, but it wasn't a reservoir, it was just a huge pit of water that had gone stagnant, and every time it rained it would flood into the camp. So they were having to control that and keep making sure that never got flooded, and at the same time they were producing water with this filtration system and providing pumps that people could, and then basically saying to them, listen, if you want to come to the pump and take water, you got to learn how to clean your bucket. So they were installing discipline into them. And
we support that.
Absolutely. And but it wasn't as simple as us turning up with, I was there with a filmmaker, a journalist, and myself. There were 3 of us, and it wasn't as simple as just marching into the camp and saying, hey, we're Oxfam and we're here to take some pictures and shoot some film. even though Oxfam were working there in that capacity, so we had to go through the route of talking to the elder, and the elder was a doctor who worked in Canada, who'd come all the way back from Canada, and he described his journey to me of how he got to Bor in South Sudan from Canada. And I thought it was bad enough me coming from London, Heathrow, to get to South Sudan. It was just, I think it took him 11 days of pure travel to get from, it was unbelievable.
Quit complaining about that traffic on the 405.
Yeah, totally. It was humbling. And he was there to rescue his mother and get her safe. And this was a camp, so we had to talk to him, and he wanted to know a little bit about us, and he said, you're fine, you can come in. We don't let any journalists in here. The journalists just come here and they do their story and they leave at our expense, and we don't have that. But you're providing water, you guys can come in. And so we had carte blanche to wander through the camp and do what we like. And everybody knew the elder has granted these guys are cool, they're fine, do what you like. So this was a camp that had been attacked by the Dinka tribe a month earlier, and in order to try and build you a picture, if you can imagine the two football pitches, you had the UN camp, and then within the UN camp there was this other camp that they were living in, and it had a perimeter around it. It was just barbed wire and a perimeter, and it was about the size of two football pitches. And they were wanting, the Koreans were meant to be building another space because their latrines had collapsed because of the rain, and they, it was the conditions were abominable. But this perimeter was on the outside of this perimeter was Dinka land, and the Dinkas had come in and they had attacked one night. They had just stood on the outside over the fence and with machine guns just shot away, and they killed 100 of the tribe. Women, children, kids. I mean, we were talking to kids where bullets were coming through. I mean, they just live in it's literally a couple of bamboo poles and some just white material. That's what these people were living in. But if you went into these homes that they'd created, they were just spotless inside. And then you realize again the dignity that, you just have to be so careful as you just don't wander around gung-ho. Just, these are very proud people, and they're in this situation they don't want to be in. And what's more, they can't get out, because if they try and leave this camp, they'll just be shot dead, by the opposing tribe. And it was like that throughout Sudan. So it wasn't necessarily just one tribe being protected. It was the Dinka in one camp, it was Nuer in the other, and they were being protected from the others. And they were. I remember you saying earlier, Jocko, did you ever notice the state of their lives or their fear ever being etched on their faces wherever you've travelled? And if this was one place that I saw it was in this camp, and they were petrified that this was going to happen again, because the UN hadn't reacted in time when the first attack happened, and so they just thought this is just going to happen again, and who's going to protect us? And that is, again, a situation where you're thinking, when I leave this place, I'm going to get on my plane and I'm going to fly home. And yet they are still going to be in that camp, and they're still not going to be able to leave. And in this camp, you're talking to young guys that were professionals working in Juba. And, that was the closest I had as an experience to Sri Lanka, was South Sudan.
And you brought that attitude home. And your next...
As usual, yeah.